In the beginning, these words have echoed through millennia, carrying with them the weight of mystery, wonder, and profound questions about our very existence. Tonight, we're going to step back into the mists of time to explore not just one story of creation, but many weaving together the biblical narrative with the rich tapestry of ancient beliefs that surrounded it. We'll walk through gardens unseen, witness the first choices that changed everything, and discover how our ancestors across the ancient world understood the moment when something emerged from nothing. From the familiar verses of Genesis to the clay tablets of Babylon, from the wisdom of Egypt to the whispered meanings behind the serpent's words, we're going to explore the deepest questions humanity has ever asked. So, before we begin our journey, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these explorations of faith and history. And let me know in the comments what story resonates with you. It's always wonderful to see. Now, let's find a quiet space, settle in, and let our spirits wander back to the very beginning of all things. Verse 1. A garden unseen, imagining Eden's every day? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping through a threshold that exists beyond time. The air itself seems different here, cleaner, somehow more alive. This is Eden, not as a theological concept or a symbol, but as a place where two human souls lived their daily lives before the world as we know it came to be. The Hebrew word Eden means delight, pleasure, but what would that have looked like in the rhythm of ordinary days? Let's walk together through this garden that existed before toil, before the sweat of labor, before the ground itself became resistant to human touch. The rhythm of paradise. The sun rises differently here. There's no harsh glare, no need to shield one's eyes. The light seems to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, warm and golden, casting no shadows that bring darkness. Adam and Eve wake not to the jarring call of necessity, but to the gentle invitation of a new day. Their first consciousness each morning might have been of the garden itself, the way certain flowers only open their petals at dawn, releasing fragrances that had no earthly comparison. Perhaps they learned to read the subtle signs. Which trees bore fruit that was perfect for breaking their fast? Which streams ran coolest in the early hours? The biblical text tells us that God planted every tree that was pleasant to sight and good for food. Imagine walking among these trees, not the struggle of agriculture we know, but abundance that required no coaxing. Fruits that hung heavy and willing, their sweetness unmarred by the bitterness that would later come to characterize much of human sustenance. Communion with creation. But Eden was more than a place of physical perfection. It was a realm where the boundaries between human and animal, between consciousness and instinct, were beautifully blurred. The text tells us that Adam gave names to all the animals, but think of what this means beyond the simple act of labeling. To name something in the ancient Hebrew, understanding was to perceive its essence, to recognize its deepest nature. Adam didn't assign arbitrary sounds to creatures. He somehow saw into their very being and spoke forth what they truly were. The lion's majesty, the dove's gentleness, the elephant's wisdom. He perceived these qualities and gave them voice. Picture the daily interactions. Animals that approached without fear, that seemed to understand human speech, that moved through the garden with a harmony that spoke of perfect design. No predator and prey, no struggle for survival, just the peaceful coexistence of beings who all recognized their place in the greater symphony of creation. The presence of the divine. Perhaps most mysterious of all was the daily communion with the divine. The text mentions God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. What would this have been like? Not the overwhelming, trembling encounter that would later characterize divine appearances, but something intimate and natural. Maybe it was a time of gentle conversation, of sharing the discoveries of the day. God asking Adam and Eve what they had learned, what had brought them joy, what questions had arisen in their hearts. The divine teacher and the eager students walking together through paths that led not to destinations, but to deeper understanding. The evening air would have been perfect, never too warm, never too cool. The sounds of the garden settling into its nighttime rhythm, the soft calls of evening birds, the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant sound of water flowing over stones. And in this perfect setting, the first humans would have felt completely at home, completely safe, completely loved. Work that was play. Even in Eden, there was work to be done. The Hebrew text says that Adam was placed in the garden to till it and keep it. But this wasn't the backbreaking labor that would come later. This was work that was pure joy, the kind of activity that flows from passion rather than necessity. Think of a master gardener who spends hours among their plants, not because they must, but because they cannot imagine being anywhere else. Adam and Eve's work was like this, a dance of cooperation with the natural world, a daily act of creativity and care that brought deep satisfaction. They might have spent their mornings guiding the growth of new plants, their afternoons exploring the far reaches of the garden, their evenings in quiet contemplation of the beauty they had helped to nurture. Work and rest, activity and stillness, all flowing together in perfect harmony. The innocence of unknowing. Central to Eden's perfection was the absence of certain knowledge. Adam and Eve lived in a state of blessed innocence, not ignorance, but a kind of pure awareness that hadn't yet been complicated by the weight of moral choice. They knew no shame, walking together in perfect openness and trust. Their bodies were simply what they were, vehicles for their souls, instruments of their love for each other and for creation. There was no self-consciousness, no comparison, no hiding. They were completely themselves, completely accepted, completely whole. They knew no fear, because they had never experienced danger or loss. They knew no anger, because they had never encountered injustice or frustration. They knew no sadness, because they had never said goodbye to anything beloved. Their emotional landscape was painted in colors of joy, wonder, contentment, and love. The approaching shadow. But even in this perfect garden, even in this state of blessed innocence, there was one tree that stood apart. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not evil in itself, but pregnant with possibility, with choice, with the potential for everything to change. It stood there day after day, its fruit perhaps no different in appearance from any other, but it carried within it the power to transform paradise into something else entirely. Adam and Eve would have passed it in their daily walks, perhaps pausing to look at it, to wonder about the single prohibition that had been placed upon their perfect freedom. They could not have understood, in their innocence, what that tree truly represented. They could not have grasped the weight of the choice that awaited them, the door that it would open, the world that lay beyond its threshold. But the tree was there, patient and waiting, as the days of Eden flowed by in their perfect rhythm. And in the distance, barely perceptible, the shadow of a different kind of future was beginning to gather, preparing to enter this place of light and transform it forever. The nature sounds fade slightly, and the music takes on a more contemplative, slightly anticipatory tone. In our next segment, we'll witness the moment when innocence encounters choice, when the perfect rhythm of Eden is interrupted by the first great decision that would echo through all of human history. We'll walk with Adam and Eve as they face the serpent, make their choice, and discover what lies beyond the boundaries of paradise. Verse 2. Adam and Eve, the first exiles. There are moments in human history when everything changes not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of small choices, but in a single instant when the world transforms from what it was into something entirely new. The moment we're about to witness is perhaps the most profound of all such moments. The first time human beings chose knowledge over innocence, independence over trust, the uncertain future over the perfect present. The serpent's approach. The serpent came to Eve when she was alone, or perhaps not entirely alone, for the text suggests Adam was with her, silent and listening. Picture this scene. Eve moving through the garden with the same ease she had known since her first breath, perhaps drawn by curiosity toward the one tree that remained untouched in their daily explorations. The serpent in these early verses is not yet the symbol of evil we might expect. The Hebrew word used, nakash, suggests something bright, shining, perhaps even beautiful. This was a creature of intelligence and eloquence, one who could speak with sophisticated reasoning and gentle persuasion. Has God indeed said, "You shall not eat of every tree of the garden"? The question comes not as a challenge, but as a conversation starter, the kind of gentle probing that invites deeper reflection. Notice how the serpent begins, not with outright contradiction, but with a question that invites Eve to examine what she has been told. The birth of doubt. Eve's response reveals something touching about the innocence of that first world. She recites the command accurately, even adding to it, "Neither shall you touch it," perhaps showing how carefully she and Adam had honored the boundary that had been set. But in her very precision, we see the first hairline crack in the perfect trust that had characterized their relationship with the divine. The serpent's response is swift and decisive. "You will not surely die." Here is the first direct contradiction of God's word ever spoken in human hearing. And with it comes the first promise of something beyond the current order. Your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. For the first time, Eve is invited to consider that their current existence might be lacking something, that there might be knowledge, experience, even power that was being withheld from them. The serpent paints a picture of limitation, where before there had been only abundance, of restriction, where before there had been only freedom. A moment of choice. What happened next has been contemplated by theologians, philosophers, and storytellers for millennia. The text tells us that Eve saw the tree was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. But beneath these simple words lies the first human experience of temptation, a moment when desire and reasoning converge to challenge divine command. Try to imagine Eve's state of mind in those crucial seconds. She had never experienced deception, never had reason to question whether someone was telling her the truth. The serpent's words carried the weight of new possibility, the allure of wisdom that seemed just within reach. And there was Adam, standing beside her, perhaps wrestling with the same thoughts, the same longings. The fruit, we don't know what kind, despite centuries of artistic tradition, was taken and eaten. First by Eve, then by Adam. The text gives us no details about the taste, the texture, the immediate physical sensation. But it tells us something far more profound. Then the eyes of both of them were opened. The awakening to shame. The first consequence of their choice was not death, not physical pain, but a completely new kind of awareness. They knew that they were naked. This wasn't simply noticing what had always been true. This was the birth of self-consciousness, of comparison, of the ability to judge their own state and find it wanting. For the first time, Adam and Eve looked at themselves and felt something other than perfect contentment. They experienced shame, not guilt for what they had done, but a deep discomfort with what they were. And their first response was to hide, to cover themselves, to seek concealment from the very bodies that had been their joy and their perfect expression of love. They made coverings from fig leaves, the first clothing, the first attempt to change their natural state through their own efforts. But these coverings were more than practical. They were symbolic of a fundamental shift in how they understood themselves and their place in the world. The sound of footsteps. Then came the sound they had always welcomed, the approach of the divine presence in the cool of the evening. But now, for the first time, this sound brought not joy, but terror. They hid among the trees, these beings who had once walked openly with their Creator, now cowering in the shadows of their own making. The call came gently, as it always had. Where are you? Not the question of an angry judge seeking to condemn, but the call of a parent looking for a beloved child. God knew where they were, of course. This was an invitation to come forward, to speak, to acknowledge what had changed. Adam's response reveals how profoundly the world had shifted. I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. Fear, that emotion unknown in Eden, had entered human experience. And with it came the impulse to hide, to protect, to withdraw from the very presence that had once been their greatest joy. The first blame? When pressed about their disobedience, Adam's response marks another tragic first. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate. Here is the birth of blame. The first time a human being sought to escape responsibility by pointing to another. And notice the subtle accusation embedded in his words, not just blaming Eve, but implying that God himself bore responsibility for giving her to him. Eve's response was simpler, but equally evasive. The serpent deceived me, and I ate. The blame shifts again, from human to animal, from responsibility to victimhood. The perfect unity that had characterized their relationship was broken, replaced by the all-too-human tendency to protect oneself at the expense of others. The pronouncement of consequences. What followed was not arbitrary punishment, but the natural unfolding of the choice they had made. The serpent, once upright and beautiful, would crawl on its belly and eat dust. The ground would become resistant to human cultivation, yielding its produce only through painful labor. Childbirth would become a source of pain as well as joy. And death, that ultimate boundary, would enter human experience. But even in these consequences, we see hints of hope. The enmity between the serpent and humanity would ultimately lead to the serpent's defeat. The pain of childbirth would be accompanied by the joy of new life. The resistance of the ground would teach the value of persistence and cooperation. The first mercy, perhaps most touching of all, is the detail that follows the pronouncement of consequences. God made clothing for Adam and Eve, not the rough coverings they had fashioned for themselves, but garments of skin that would truly protect them. Even in their exile, even in their new state of separation, they were not abandoned. They were cared for, provided for, loved. This was the first act of mercy in human history, the divine response to human failing, not with abandonment, but with provision, not with rejection, but with protection. Their innocence was gone, but they were not alone. The exile begins. The final act of this cosmic drama was the exile itself. Adam and Eve could not remain in Eden not as punishment, but as protection. Having chosen knowledge over innocence, they could not be allowed to eat from the tree of life and live forever in their new state of separation and struggle. The cherubim with flaming swords were not guards keeping them out, but guardians preventing them from a fate worse than death, eternal existence, in a state of alienation from their true home. The way back to Eden was closed, but the way forward into a new kind of existence was opening. The first steps beyond. Imagine that first step outside the garden. For Adam and Eve, it was the beginning of everything we know as human history. They walked into a world that was still beautiful, but no longer perfect, still abundant, but no longer effortless, still full of possibility, but now also full of danger. They carried with them the memory of what had been lost, but also the hope of what might yet be found. They were the first exiles, but they were also the first pioneers, the first to venture into the unknown territory of human existence as we know it. Behind them, the garden remained, guarded and waiting. Ahead of them lay the vast expanse of a world that would know both great sorrow and great joy, devastating loss and magnificent triumph. They were no longer innocent, but they were free. They were no longer perfect, but they were fully human. The music becomes more complex, with both minor and major themes interweaving, suggesting both loss and hope. In our next segment, we'll step back from this intimate drama to explore the broader context of creation stories that surrounded the biblical narrative. We'll discover how other ancient cultures understood the beginning of all things, and how their stories both echo and diverge from the account we've just witnessed. Verse 3. In the beginning, creation narratives across the ancient Near East, the story of Adam and Eve did not arise in a vacuum. When the ancient Hebrew scribes set down the words of Genesis, they were writing within a world rich with creation stories narratives that had been told and retold for centuries around the fires of nomadic camps, in the temples of great cities, and in the royal courts of mighty empires. To truly understand the uniqueness of the biblical account, we must first listen to these other voices. These other attempts to answer the fundamental question that has haunted humanity since consciousness first dawned. How did all of this begin? The Babylonian Genesis, Enuma Elish. In the great libraries of Babylon, on tablets of baked clay, written in the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script, we find one of the most influential creation stories of the ancient world, the Enuma Elish, named for its opening words, "When on high." Picture the scene as this story was first performed, perhaps during the Great New Year festival in Babylon. A temple is filled with flickering lamplight, the air thick with incense. A priest-poet steps forward to recite the ancient words that tell of the time before time, when the cosmos was nothing but primordial waters. When on high the heaven did not exist, nor the earth below, Apsu, the freshwater ocean, was there, the first, the begetter, and Tiamat, she who bore them all. Here is a vision of beginning that is both similar to and radically different from Genesis. Like the biblical account, it begins with waters, but these are not the ordered waters over which the Spirit of God moves. These are chaotic, primordial forces, divine beings in their own right. Apsu and Tiamat, the freshwater and saltwater oceans, mingle and give birth to the first generation of gods. But this is not a peaceful creation. The younger gods are noisy, disruptive, disturbing the rest of their ancient parents. Apsu decides to destroy them, but he is killed by Ea, one of his own offspring. Tiamat, in her rage and grief, becomes a dragon of chaos, determined to destroy the younger generation that has brought such upheaval to the primordial order. The battle that follows is cosmic in scope. Marduk, the champion of the younger gods, faces Tiamat in single combat. He fills her with wind until she swells like a balloon, then shoots an arrow into her heart. From her corpse, he creates the heavens and the earth, the sky from her upper body, the earth from her lower. This is creation through violence, order emerging from chaos through conquest and domination. The world is literally built from the body of the defeated chaos dragon, and humanity is created from the blood of Tiamat's defeated champion, Kingu, mixed with clay created specifically to serve the gods and perform the labor they find tedious. The Egyptian vision, multiple traditions. Travel south from Babylon to the land of the Nile, and we encounter not one but several creation stories, each reflecting different theological traditions and different cities' claims to primacy in the cosmic order. In the theology of Heliopolis, the great sun city, creation begins with Adam, the self-created God who emerges from the primordial waters of none. Alone in the cosmos, Adam creates through an act that is both mystical and surprisingly physical. He masturbates. And from his seed come Shu and Tefnut, the first divine couple. They in turn give birth to Geb and Nut, and the process of creation unfolds through divine procreation. But in Memphis, the ancient capital, the priests told a different story. Here, Ptah is the creator god, and he creates not through physical acts, but through the power of speech and thought. There came into being as the heart, and there came into being as the tongue something in the form of Adam. This is creation through divine word, through the power of speaking reality into existence, much closer to the biblical account of creation through divine command. In Hermopolis, yet another tradition speaks of the Ogdoad, 8 primordial deities representing the chaotic forces that existed before creation, darkness and light, hiddenness and revelation, infinity and nothingness. From their interaction comes the cosmic egg, from which the sun god is born to begin the work of creation. The Mesopotamian flood, echoes of universal catastrophe. The ancient Near East was haunted by flood stories, and in these narratives, we find some of the most striking parallels to biblical accounts. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the world's oldest literary masterpiece, we meet Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who tells his story to the grieving hero Gilgamesh. The gods, disturbed by the noise and overpopulation of humanity, decide to send a great flood to destroy all life. But Ea, the god of wisdom and water, warns Utnapishtim in a dream, telling him to build a great boat and save representatives of all living creatures. The parallels to Noah's story are unmistakable: the divine warning, the ark, the animals, the dove sent out to find dry land. But the differences are equally significant. In the Mesopotamian account, the gods are petty and capricious, destroying humanity almost on a whim. When the flood is over, they are horrified by what they have done, gathering like flies around Utnapishtim's sacrifice. The flood is the result of divine irritation, not divine justice responding to human moral failure. The Canaanite cycle, Baal and the seasonal gods. In the land that would become Israel, the Canaanites told stories of creation that were deeply connected to the cycles of nature, the eternal struggle between fertility and barrenness, life and death. The great god El was the father of the gods, the ancient one who dwelt at the source of the rivers, at the meeting place of the two deeps. But the active force in creation was Baal, the storm god, locked in eternal conflict with Mo, the god of death and drought. Each year, Baal would die and descend to the underworld, and the land would become barren. Each year, he would be resurrected, and the rains would return, bringing life back to the earth. This is creation as an ongoing process, not a one-time event. The world is constantly being created and recreated through the seasonal cycles, through the eternal struggle between the forces of life and death, fertility and barrenness. The stability of creation depends not on divine decree, but on divine victory that must be won again and again. The Hebrew distinction, creation through divine word. Against this backdrop of cosmic battles, sexual procreation, and cyclical regeneration, the Hebrew creation account in Genesis stands out with remarkable distinctiveness. Here is creation that is neither violent nor sexual, neither capricious nor cyclical. It is creation through divine word, through the simple sovereign command, "Let there be light." The Hebrew god Elohim does not emerge from primordial waters or defeat chaos monsters. He exists before creation, independent of it, creating not from necessity, but from choice. The primordial waters are not divine beings to be conquered, but simply the raw material that awaits the divine word to give it shape and purpose. Each day of creation unfolds with the same majestic rhythm. God speaks, creation responds, God sees that it is good. There is no struggle, no uncertainty, no need for divine consultation or conflict. Creation is the overflow of divine goodness, the expression of divine creativity and love. And when humanity is created, it is not from the blood of defeated rebels, or as an afterthought to serve the gods. Humanity is created in the image of God, given dominion over creation, blessed and commissioned to be fruitful and multiply. The crown of creation is not divine victory, but divine rest, the Sabbath, the day when God ceases from creative work and simply enjoys what has been made. The theological revolution. What we see in the Hebrew creation account is nothing less than a theological revolution. In a world where gods were forces of nature, often capricious and conflicted, the Hebrew scriptures present a God who transcends nature while remaining intimately involved with it. In a world where creation was the result of cosmic violence, Genesis presents creation as the result of divine love and wisdom. The chaos waters that appear in Genesis are not divine beings to be defeated, but simply the state of things before God's creative word brings order and beauty. The sun and moon, worshipped as gods throughout the ancient Near East, are simply lights that God has placed in the sky to mark times and seasons. The great sea monsters, symbols of chaos and evil in other mythologies, are simply creatures that God has made, blessed, and called good. This is not to say that the biblical writers were unaware of these other traditions. Echoes of them appear throughout the Hebrew scriptures, references to Leviathan and Rahab, to God's victory over the chaotic waters, to the divine council. But these mythological elements are transformed, subordinated to the overarching vision of one sovereign God who creates through word, governs through wisdom, and relates to creation through love. The human question. Perhaps most significantly, the Hebrew creation account addresses the fundamental human question differently than its ancient Near Eastern counterparts. In most creation myths, humans are created to serve the gods, to provide them with food and labor, to maintain the cosmic order through ritual and sacrifice. Humanity exists for the sake of the divine. But in Genesis, the relationship is reversed. The creation exists for humanity's sake, and humanity exists for God's sake, not as servants but as image bearers, not as slaves but as stewards. The garden is planted for human delight and habitation. The animals are brought to the human to be named and known. The rhythm of work and rest is established not for divine convenience, but for human flourishing. This radical vision of human dignity and purpose would echo through history, shaping Western concepts of individual worth, moral responsibility, and the meaning of human existence. It presents a universe that is neither indifferent nor hostile to human aspirations, but one that is designed as a home for beings created in the image of the divine. The enduring questions. As we step back from this survey of ancient creation stories, we're struck by both the diversity and the underlying unity of human attempts to understand our origins. Whether through cosmic battle or divine word, whether through sexual procreation or sovereign decree, all of these accounts grapple with the same fundamental mysteries. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the relationship between order and chaos? What is the purpose of human existence? The biblical account offers its own distinctive answers to these questions, but it does so within a conversation that had been going on for centuries. It takes up the ancient concerns about primordial waters and divine creative power, but it transforms them through its vision of a God who is both transcendent and immanent, both sovereign and loving. In our final segment, we'll explore one of the most enigmatic figures in this ancient drama, the serpent who brought temptation to Eden. We'll discover how serpents have been understood across cultures and centuries, and what deeper meanings may lie coiled within this most mysterious of creation's creatures. Verse 4. The serpent speaks, symbols of wisdom and temptation. Of all the creatures that populate the creation stories of the ancient world, perhaps none is as fascinating, as contradictory, or as deeply embedded in human consciousness as the serpent. In the Garden of Eden, it appears as the catalyst of humanity's first moral choice, but this single biblical appearance barely scratches the surface of the serpent's complex role in human mythology, religion, and psychology. Tonight, we'll uncoil the many meanings that have been wrapped around this most enigmatic of creatures, exploring how different cultures have understood the serpent's dual nature as both wisdom bringer and destroyer, healer and tempter, symbol of renewal and agent of chaos. The ancient serpent, primordial wisdom. Long before the serpent appeared in Eden, it had already established itself as one of humanity's most powerful symbols. In the earliest human settlements, serpent imagery appears carved in stone, molded in clay, and painted on cave walls. There is something about the serpent's form and behavior that speaks to the deepest levels of human consciousness. Perhaps it begins with the serpent's most distinctive characteristic, its ability to shed its skin and emerge renewed. To ancient peoples, this was nothing short of miraculous. Here was a creature that seemed to conquer death itself, that could literally be reborn while still living. The shed skin became a symbol of transformation, of the possibility of leaving one's old self behind and becoming something new. In the ancient Near East, serpents were often associated with the deepest wisdom and the most sacred knowledge. The Hebrew word for the serpent in Eden Nakash comes from a root that means to shine or to divine. This was not necessarily a creature of evil, but one of luminous intelligence, capable of perceiving truths hidden from other beings. The serpent in Mesopotamian thought, in the land between the rivers, where writing was first invented and cities first rose, the serpent occupied a complex place in religious and mythological thought. The great chaos dragon Tiamat, whom we encountered in the Enuma Elish, was often depicted in serpentine form. The primordial waters given shape as a cosmic serpent that had to be defeated for creation to begin. But serpents were also associated with healing and wisdom. The god Ningishida, whose name means Lord of the Good Tree, was depicted as a serpent or with serpent attributes. He was a deity of healing, fertility, and the underworld, a god who could move between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, carrying messages and medicines between worlds. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it is a serpent that steals the plant of immortality from the hero, emerging from the water to snatch away humanity's chance at eternal life. But this act, while tragic for Gilgamesh, is also strangely necessary. The serpent takes the plant not out of malice, but according to its nature, following the cosmic order that keeps immortality from mortal beings. Egyptian serpent mysteries. Travel south to Egypt, and the serpent's symbolism becomes even more complex. On the pharaoh's crown, the Urias a rearing cobra symbolized divine protection and sovereign power. This was the serpent as guardian, as the fierce protector of sacred order against the forces of chaos. But Egypt also knew the serpent as chaos itself. Apep, the great serpent of darkness, was the eternal enemy of Ra, the sun god. Each night, as Ra journeyed through the underworld, Apep would attack his solar bark, trying to prevent the sun from rising again. The daily sunrise was evidence of Ra's victory over the serpent of darkness, but the battle had to be fought again and again, night after night. Yet even this chaotic serpent served a purpose in Egyptian thought. Without Apep, there would be no need for Ra's daily victory, no cycle of death and rebirth, no dynamic tension that kept the cosmos alive and moving. The serpent of chaos was as necessary as the god of order, part of the eternal dance that sustained all existence. In the mystery traditions of Egypt, the serpent represented the Kundalini-like force that could bring spiritual awakening. The Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, became a symbol of eternal return, of the cyclical nature of existence, of the unity that underlies all apparent opposites. Greek wisdom and the serpent. The Greeks, who gave us philosophy and drama, also gave us some of the most complex serpent symbolism in the ancient world. At Delphi, the most sacred oracle in Greece, the Pythia delivered prophecies while seated over a chasm from which vapors rose, vapors that were said to come from the rotting body of Python, the great serpent that Apollo had slain to establish his oracle. This was wisdom that came through the serpent's death, prophecy that emerged from the serpent's decay. The priestess who channeled this wisdom was called the Pythia, taking her name from the defeated serpent. Knowledge and divination were inseparable from the serpent's power, even or especially when that serpent had been conquered and transformed. Asclepius, the god of healing, carried a staff around which a serpent was coiled, the caduceus that still serves as a symbol of medicine today. Here the serpent represented the power that could kill or cure, the knowledge of poisons that could also be medicines, the thin line between destruction and healing that characterized the physician's art. The Celtic serpent, earth wisdom. In the misty lands of the Celts, serpents were associated with the earth itself, with the wisdom that flowed through the land like underground rivers. Celtic serpents were often depicted as dwelling in sacred wells, springs, and underground caves, places where the boundary between the upper world and the underworld was thin. The Celtic goddess Brigid was sometimes depicted with serpent companions, and serpents were seen as guardians of sacred sites and keepers of ancient wisdom. They were creatures of the liminal spaces, able to move between worlds, to carry messages from the ancestors, to reveal hidden truths to those who knew how to listen. When Christianity came to Celtic lands, many of these serpent associations were transformed rather than eliminated. The famous story of St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland may be understood as a metaphor for the displacement of older serpent-associated spiritual traditions by the new faith. The serpent in Eastern wisdom. Far to the east, in the spiritual traditions of India and Asia, the serpent took on yet another layer of meaning. The Naga, the serpent beings of Hindu and Buddhist mythology, were often depicted as wise, powerful, and benevolent. They were the guardians of treasures, both material and spiritual, dwelling in magnificent underwater palaces and possessing knowledge of the deepest mysteries. In Kundalini Yoga, the serpent represents the coiled spiritual energy that lies dormant at the base of the spine, waiting to be awakened and guided upward through the chakras to bring enlightenment. This is the serpent as the very force of spiritual transformation, the power that can lift consciousness from the material to the divine. The Buddha himself was said to have been protected by a great serpent king, Mukalinda, who spread his hood over the meditating sage during a terrible storm. Here the serpent appears as protector and ally on the spiritual path, not as tempter or enemy. The biblical serpent, a unique role. Against this rich background of serpent symbolism, the biblical account takes on new dimensions. The serpent in Eden appears to draw on many of these traditional associations. It is clearly a creature of unusual wisdom and intelligence, capable of sophisticated reasoning and persuasive speech. But the biblical narrative also transforms these traditional meanings. The serpent's wisdom is not presented as inherently evil, but its use of that wisdom to encourage disobedience to divine command places it in opposition to the divine order. The serpent offers knowledge. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. But it is knowledge that comes at the cost of innocence and harmony. The curse that falls upon the serpent, on your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat all the days of your life, suggests that its current form is not its original state. This was once a creature of greater dignity and beauty, reduced to its present condition as a consequence of its role in humanity's fall. The serpent as tempter, the psychology of choice. But what does the serpent truly represent in the Eden narrative? On one level, it is simply a character in the story, the agent through which temptation comes to humanity. But on a deeper level, it may represent something more fundamental, the voice of possibility, the suggestion that things could be other than they are. The serpent's temptation is not crude or violent. It is subtle, sophisticated, appealing to legitimate desires, the desire for wisdom, for knowledge, for growth and development. The serpent doesn't lie about the effects of eating the fruit. Adam and Eve's eyes are indeed opened. They do gain knowledge of good and evil. But the serpent omits the cost of this knowledge, the price that must be paid for crossing the boundary between innocence and experience. In this sense, the serpent represents the voice within human consciousness that questions limits, that seeks to transcend boundaries, that refuses to accept "because I said so" as a sufficient reason for obedience. This is not necessarily evil. It is the same impulse that drives scientific discovery, artistic creation, and moral progress. But it is also the impulse that can lead to overreach, to the pursuit of knowledge or power without wisdom, to the rejection of legitimate authority, the serpent's continuing presence. The serpent's role in the Eden narrative is brief but pivotal. After the fall, it largely disappears from the immediate biblical story, but it casts a long shadow through the rest of Scripture and through human consciousness. In the book of Revelation, the ancient serpent appears again as the dragon that wages war against heaven, the same tempter that appeared in Eden now revealed in its full cosmic significance. But even in its role as tempter and enemy, the serpent serves a purpose in the divine economy. Without the serpent's temptation, there would be no choice, no moral development, no possibility of growth, from innocence to maturity. The serpent's challenge to divine authority creates the space within which human free will can operate and human character can be formed. The serpent in art and literature. Throughout history, artists and writers have been fascinated by the serpent's dual nature. In medieval art, the serpent in Eden is often depicted with a woman's head and torso, emphasizing its seductive and deceptive nature. Renaissance artists sometimes portrayed it as a beautiful creature, its attractiveness making the temptation more understandable. In literature, from Milton's Paradise Lost to modern fantasy novels, the serpent has continued to evolve as a symbol. Sometimes it appears as pure evil, sometimes as a necessary catalyst for human development, sometimes as a misunderstood figure caught between opposing cosmic forces. The serpent's wisdom, integration, and transcendence. Perhaps the deepest truth about the serpent is that it represents the necessity of integration, the need to acknowledge and work with the darker, more challenging aspects of existence, rather than simply trying to eliminate them. The serpent's wisdom is dangerous precisely because it is real wisdom, knowledge that can be used for good or ill. In many spiritual traditions, the path to enlightenment involves not the destruction of the serpent, but its transformation. The poison becomes medicine, the tempter becomes teacher, the enemy becomes ally. This is the serpent that rises up the healing staff, the kundalini that ascends the spine, the Ouroboros that completes the circle of existence. The eternal questions. As we reach the end of our journey through the serpent's many meanings, we're left with the questions that have haunted humanity since that first conversation in the garden. What is the relationship between knowledge and wisdom? Between freedom and responsibility? Between growth and loss? The serpent offers no easy answers, but it poses the questions that make us human. It reminds us that consciousness itself is a kind of exile from innocence, that knowledge brings both power and burden, that the price of wisdom is often the loss of simplicity. In the end, a serpent may be the most honest character in the Eden narrative. It tells Adam and Eve that they will become like God, knowing good and evil, and they do. It doesn't promise that this knowledge will make them happy, only that it will make them different. The serpent speaks the truth about the nature of moral choice, even as it leads humanity into the complexities and ambiguities of ethical existence. See zero inclusion. And so our journey through the ancient stories of beginning draws to a close. We've walked through the Garden of Innocence, witnessed the first great choice that changed everything, explored the rich tapestry of creation stories that surrounded the biblical narrative, and uncoiled the complex symbolism of the serpent that brought knowledge and exile to humanity. These are not just ancient stories, they are the foundation stones of human consciousness, the myths that still shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. They speak to questions that remain as urgent today as they were thousands of years ago. Who are we? Why are we here? What is the meaning of choice, of knowledge, of suffering, of hope? The Garden of Eden may be lost to us, guarded by cherubim and flaming swords, but its memory lives on in every human heart that longs for perfect peace, perfect love, perfect understanding. And perhaps that longing itself is the gift, the divine spark that drives us to create, to love, to seek truth, to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of our exile. The serpent may have spoken truly when it said we would become like God, knowing good and evil. But what it didn't say, what perhaps it couldn't know is that this knowledge would also teach us about grace, about forgiveness, about the possibility of redemption even in the midst of loss. The story continues, as it always has, in every choice we make, every act of kindness or cruelty, every moment when we choose wisdom over ignorance, love over fear, hope over despair. We are all children of Eden, inheritors of both the blessing and the burden of consciousness, citizens of the strange and wonderful world that begins just beyond the garden gate. Thank you for joining me on this journey. to the ancient stories that still shape our souls. May you find in these timeless narratives not just historical curiosity, but living wisdom for your own path to the complex and beautiful mystery of human existence. Until we meet again in the quiet spaces where stories live and breathe, where the past speaks to the present, and where the deepest questions of the heart find their rest in wonder.